Hello, everyone, and welcome back once again to Ion Cricket. And joining with me for a very special episode, Viren Berwalgi, a very own Viren, and a very special guest, Mark Machado. Not the first time Mark is joining with us on Ion Cricket. You have met him a lot of times on Ion Cricket. So thank you very much once again, Mark, for joining with us.
Thanks
It's
for
been a huge
having me.
pleasure. So now let's. The big talk is about T20 World Cup, obviously. So I mean, we have to talk about West Indies. They're in great form. They're back in the top three in the world rankings as well. And England finding their feet against Oman. Getting that net run rate back to +3. So now let's just start first with Sri Lanka for a little chat about Sri Lanka. Now we're officially out, no wins yet, and we have that game against Netherlands. I think a win there is much needed because we need to get some confidence back. I mean, the LPL is obviously next, but yeah, and I think because we are not playing the Champions Trophy next, we have a good gap. I think I feel that's really good. Before an ICC tournament, we'll be playing another ICC tournament in 2026. So I think that gap is very welcoming for us to sort things out. Don't you think, Mark?
Yeah, I think so. I think you know when I look back on the two games that we ended up playing that resulted in us not progressing through. I just think you can look at player selection, you can look at ways in which batters got out, or you can look at various decisions. Kusumenda's dropping stubs and people like that, right? And moments like that. But the kind of overwhelming thought for all of it is in those two games, Sri Lanka just had no luck at all, did they? Right? You get a little bit of luck somewhere. When you think of our runs to win it in 2014 or runs to finals in 2011 or whatever, you think there's just key moments in key games where the ball could have gone one way or the other and it's gone in favour of Sri Lanka, right? And you look across those two games and there is just no luck at all. I think from the moment, you think you win the toss at New York and you think, oh, it's good, we've won the toss. That's the first battle won, as it were. And it turns out to be the most horrendous pitch that they can't read. I'm going to give the players and the coaching team the kind of benefit of the doubt with that pitch and go, I don't think they could have ever estimated how strange that pitch was going to play and how bad that pitch was going to be able to play on. And they couldn't have realised, at least when they decided to put themselves into bat, how what was gonna be the end result. Going into the tournament, we talked a lot about Sri Lanka wanted to show intent, wanted to be bold in their decisions and the way they played. I think we did see that, but it kind of blew up in our face. But I don't think this should be the end of that. I think they need to continue being bold. They need to continue making brave decisions. But I do also think, that said, that maybe a break to rethink things, figure out which player should be playing where. I think this is the kind of right time for it. And then we've got now a nice long run up to a tournament which will be in Sri Lanka as well, or parts of it will be in Sri Lanka. So I think it's a good time to take a breath and figure out what's going right and what's going wrong.
And I think in that World Cup, we'll most probably play at Sri Lanka. All the games we'll play in Sri Lanka, I think, right until the final, if we go all that long in that tournament. So, yeah, I mean, going from Sri Lanka to West Indies, thoughts on the West Indies side? Darren Sammy, the two-time World Cup winning skipper, being the coach. I mean, we are seeing him everywhere on the pitch, on the dressing room. He's everywhere for West Indies, and I think his involvement, it's having a huge effect, isn't it?
Very well said, love to see. And when Junior asked me for the caption slash title for this episode, I said we'll all rally around the West Indies now. And it's lovely to see the resurgence of the West Indies team, especially in this format. But before I delve into that question, this is a moment where we've gone full circle with the Ion Cricket. I remember Mark being very humble enough to come on for our first episode when we had less than 30 or 40 subscribers on our channel. And now, as we've on the verge of 3,000 subscribers, I can say this, people like Mark, Nicholas Brooks, etc., are the key factors behind the rise of this channel. So thank you, Mark, for agreeing to be with us for that first episode and for rejoining us today. It means a lot to us. And coming back to your question, Laksasi, I called this during an episode I did with an Indian channel, The Fifth Umpire, before the World Cup, when I said that the West Indies were going to be my favorite for this campaign. there's something about a home World Cup having Darren Sammy, who is a serial match winner and tournament winner in T20 cricket, in the dugout, and everything seemed to be clicking at the right time for the Windies. The only thing that could have made this campaign a tad better was if they managed to convince Sunil Narayan to be a part of their squad. But everything else went to plan. And it's no surprise for me that the two teams progressing from that group are West Indies and Afghanistan. I call that as well. New Zealand seemed just like Sri Lanka, tad undercooked going into this World Cup. They hadn't been together as a side for a couple of months. Sri Lanka, on our front, had a lengthy break after the hat trick of series against Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and Zimbabwe. And I think teams that have gone into this World Cup underprepared, it could be because of the IPL, it could be because of other reasons, but I think the teams that deserve a lengthy run in this campaign are through, and I agree with Mark completely. I think luck wasn't on our side in those first two games, in those three games against Nepal as well. And I think it's unfortunate. But the one thing I sincerely hope as a Sri Lankan fan, and I say this very openly, and Mark, coming in from an English standpoint, might agree with me on this. I hope Chris Silverwood is not scapegoated as a result of this. He's a brilliant, brilliant coach. I think he's taken us to two Asia Cup finals on the trot. If you gave me that when he arrived, I would have taken it. And people forget this. We've been brilliant in Test cricket. We nearly reached the World Test Championship final in the last cycle. Had it not been for that New Zealand series, or that had that first Test gone our way, I certainly would have given it our all in that second Test to win the game and get through to the final. So yes, it's unfortunate, but I think it's time we hit the reset button on the way we approach limited overs cricket. We have naturally aggressive batsmen who like to be aggressive, but without role clarity, I think it's very difficult for them to fulfill their necessary roles.
Can I just come in on that Silverwood point? I think Silverwood's a great guy. I think you're right to highlight his successes with the team, and particularly around red ball cricket. I think we're much, we're a much better red ball team now than we were when he first arrived. But that said, I don't think he has the necessary skill set to get us to where we need to be if we want to be back to being, the Grand Sri Lanka and the team that's getting to the finals of the business end of major tournaments. I think his time has probably come in that role. I think we need a much stronger character, and we need somebody who kind of, I'm not saying he doesn't inspire the boys, because I don't know, I'm not in the changing room, right? So I don't know what he's saying, but somebody who kind of almost transcends the dressing room a little bit and inspires not just the boys, but also the kind of wider Sri Lankan cricket fans as well, right? Somebody who people want to get behind and go, yeah, he's our leader. Me and Viren are fortunate enough to be fans of Liverpool FC, and we've just seen, the impact Jurgen Klopp can have, or that kind of character can have on a group of fans. And I don't necessarily know. On the latest Murali end, I suggested maybe SLC should put a play in to try and get Ravi Shastri to be the coach, because I think, if you look at the kind of characters in the Sri Lanka team at the moment, and basically I'm talking about Hasaranga, right? Because he's really our franchise player, okay? So he's someone who could take wickets in the mid and bowl difficult middle overs, and in theory should be able to score runs quickly as well. So he's not just an all-rounder who can kind of hold up an end, or a whole-rounder who can maybe pick up some runs. He's in every group. He's one of your best players, if not your best player, right? And we really need somebody who can inspire him to kind of get to that next level. We'll see what Shastri did with Virat Kohli. I mean, I don't know if SLC have enough money to be able to tempt him over. I don't know if he would fancy the job. I mean, he's one of the most popular men in the world, right? And he might fancy coming one last run at international cricket with a different side. Then I just think if we got him or a character like him, maybe Owen Morgan might be another name I would consider. Then I think you look at the talent behind this team. You look at that bowling unit. You look at some of the batters coming through like Nisanka and Asalanka, and you just think we're not that far off right? We're not as bad as it may feel. Like you just need a figurehead at the top, somebody can inspire the team and kind of pull it all together. That's my thoughts on it. Maybe I'm totally wrong, and maybe Silverwood is the man. I don't know.
And Mark, I wanted to toss this question at you. Sorry, we're going on a tangent, but I expected this to be the case with this discussion. We've spoken about personalities linked to the coaching role. There are other teams that have done the red ball, white ball split in terms of having separate coaching staff. And because we have players who are limited over specialists, the likes of Hasaranga, Tekshan, etc., if there is a split, my first question is, would we then keep the red ball side as is and let Silverwood continue with that role? But I'm going to toss one other name in there because I'm looking for personalities like the Ravi Shastris, like the Morgans. I'm thinking going slightly more left field, even someone who, like A.B. de Villiers, perhaps, someone who has that presence in a dressing room. And I think this would be a great, with no disrespect to Sri Lanka cricket, this might be a very lucrative offer for AB in terms of diving into the coaching front, because there's nothing much for him to lose. I mean, we've already hit rock bottom in limited overs cricket. So there's only one way to go from here, and I think someone like an AB, or as you said, a Morgan or Ravi, could bring Sri Lanka back to where it was in terms of coming close to our glory days.
I'm open to anyone. The only kind of thing is like what's his track record in coaching like? How available would he be? With how much does he know? What does he know about our players? What would his communication style be like in the dressing room? I think I still think our big issue is that we've got players like Hasaranga and maybe a couple of the other all-rounders who I think are kind of, I want to say their energy is potentially pointed in the wrong direction. Do you know what I mean? I'm not saying that they're not working for the team and they don't have the team's best interest at the heart. I think they do, but I think we've got to get to a situation where we're all singing off the same hymn sheet, as it were, that we're all working for a common cause. Because I think there's a little bit of I suppose it's what we call role clarity, right? It's kind of lost somewhere in the middle of it, and I think when we win, we all feel like, and I'm talking, I'm a fan who lives about as far away from Sri Lanka as it could possibly live, right? And we all feel like $1 million, but when we lose, there's like this collective feeling of being in the doldrums, and it shouldn't ever feel like that, right? It should just feel, it should feel good when you're winning, but it shouldn't feel this bad when we're losing, right? You should always feel like you're heading in the right direction. I think too much around Sri Lankan cricket, probably since 2014, has been like, it's either right, we're going to win the World Cup, or take our test status away. We do not deserve this. ICC, we're sorry for bringing the game into disrepute for how bad our players are, right? It's like self-flagellation or total self-celebration. And we need to be someone who we feel who's up for it, who really wants to do the job, and goes, right, you've got 18 months or 19 months or whatever, you've got to get this team ready for a home World Cup. Whatever happens, we know when Sri Lanka play that first game in 2026, everyone in Sri Lanka is going to be absolutely losing their minds for that team and absolutely loving it. And the hopes and aspirations of all, 25 million of us, however many of us around the world, will be pushed onto those lads when they step into the field. We know that we'll all come together to support them for the World Cup. We need somebody who's got real vision and really knows how to get the best out of these players.
And Mark, we can't wait to see you here for the 2026 World Cup. And Lakshasi, before I come back to you to pose the next question to Mark, I want to draw two parallels with Sri Lanka and England. In 2015, when England hit rock bottom after that 2015 debacle at Adelaide, they planned ahead for a home World Cup in 2019. And Morgan, Trevor Bayliss came together, rallied the troops. And by 2019, we knew the brand of cricket they were going to play. It could be erratic. You could have Roy and Bairstow smashing brilliant opening stand or getting out for single digits. It was one of the two, but there was a certain brand of cricket they played. And that's what I'd like to see with Sri Lanka cricket going into this next cycle. Yes, the results might not always go our way, but whenever Patum and Kusal walk out to bat, you know what they're going to do. Whenever Charita Lanka comes in the middle order, you know what his role is. And that's where I harp on role clarity because I think that's what's lacking here. It's hit or miss in terms of our planning and execution. But I'd like to see them having the intent to play cricket a certain type of in the Sri Lankan way and to get us back to enjoy watching Sri Lanka's limited overs game because people might forget this. It was our Sri Lankan openers, Sanath and Ramesh, who revolutionized the ODI format, brought together the concept of the power play, etc. So, yeah, I think it's time we rejig the way we think and approach limited overs cricket. And Mark said it perfectly. I think there's no better time now than to get this up and running prior to 2026.
So coming back to Sri Lanka, I mean now there's some talk that Kusal Mendis might get the nod to become the T20 skipper from the next series itself against India. Mark, your thoughts on that? Is there a need to change this because Hasaranga, he captained Sri Lanka in three bilateral series before this World Cup? Yes, this is a horrid performance from Sri Lanka, but do you think it's the correct way to go, giving the captaincy away from Hasaranga to Mendes?
My personal take is, look, I really like Chris Mendes as a player. He's, I've not seen anything to make me think that he'd be a horrendous captain or anything like that. But as I said, Hassaranga's the franchise, right? He's if we are going to win a World Cup or get far in a World Cup, it's kind of reliant on him having a out of an unbelievable tournament, finding form with bat and ball, and being really special, like we saw in the LPL when he did it for Candy last time round, right? And we need to get to position. Everything in Sri Lankan cricket around the team needs to be about getting him to be in his best form possible. I think they missed the trick by him not playing in the IPL, and also the amount of franchise cricket he misses out on. Some of that might be due to injury, but I think we need to. If you look at the best teams, they have their best players play loads of franchise cricket, and particularly make sure that they're available for the IPL because they understand that to be at your best, you've got to be playing the best as frequently as you can. There's still what I think is quite a primitive idea in Sri Lanka of don't have our best players play in the best leagues because we don't want them to be seen by the best batsmen. And to me, that just makes no sense whatsoever. Because you want them to be at that top table the whole time, working hard and playing against the better players, to learn how to face the better players and to learn what to do against the better players. So I think they need to rectify that. I think taking the captaincy away from him, just from the kind of personality, I've never seen him, never talked to him, but from what I see of him, when I see him playing, I think he's the kind of person who wouldn't react well to having the captaincy taken off him. And I don't necessarily think it's in the best interest of Sri Lankan cricket at this point to take the captaincy away from him. I still think we've got to, you kind of bet in the house on him, right? And I still think we've got to back him. There's no transfers in international cricket. You can't go and, find another Hasaranga from somewhere and bring him in, try and trade him for Hardik or something. I don't know. You can't do that, sadly. He's the guy we've got. We've got to back him. And I think part of that is going, look, you've had a bad World Cup. You'll be hurting as much as we're hurting, if not more, because you were on the field actually doing it. But we still back you, Wani. Come on, get us to where you need to get to. I think the comparison with England in 2015 is quite interesting, right? Because again, if you look at it, they did change the players around, but there was still cool players. Morgan being front and center of that, who was still part of it in all the way through. So I think they need to kind of, in some ways, that should be a blueprint, even though, I don't think we're as bad as England were in 2015. I don't think we're like anywhere near that bad. I think if, going back to those two games, if the situation was slightly different, we could have won those two games where England were nowhere at the races in 2015.
It's just a bad tournament, right? We have to accept that fact and move on from this. So, as you mentioned, I think just in my honest opinion, I think we just need to make 3 or 4 changes to this squad. In my honest opinion, I think then we are all good to go and compete with any team in the world. I think we need someone who can hit the ball hard in the first four. I think maybe to bat at number four, and maybe I'm not sure whether Matthews will continue to play after this World Cup. Not sure about that because really can't guarantee whether he'll be available for 2026. So I think if he's not available for 2026, I think the perfect thing to do is to make sure we bring someone in like a summer or someone to play that role and prepare him for the next 18, 24 months. Maybe I think we have around 24 months until the next World Cup. So yeah, I think we better move on from Sri Lanka now. We talked a lot. So going to England now, and that win against Oman, they needed that big time, isn't it, Mark? That was a huge win. But still, I think there's little ominous feeling surrounding the next game because of the weather. There's a certain aspect playing in their heads that may be the same thing that happened to Sri Lanka. That game against Nepal being washed out, the same might happen when they play against Namibia in the next game. But let's talk a bit about all that talk of Australia saying that they might manipulate the result.
So I'm not sure if you're allowed to swear on this, but I love shithassery, right? And I think what Hazelwood was saying in the press conference was hilarious. You know, England traditionally in sport has two kind of great rivals, Australia and Scotland. The fact that they're coming together and could potentially, if the results kind of if it plays out in a certain way, end up knocking England out, is hilarious, right? And you know, professional sport is about trying to get eyeballs onto the game. It's trying to make it as marketable as possible. And this, you know, the Ashes is such an important thing in cricket because of that rivalry. This kind of taps into that. I think you're not meant to take it as literally as they said it. This whole idea that they can have fined, that you know Hazelwood could be fined or Aussie players could be fined or whatever. I think is a bit much. But I can also, you know, I do understand why. You know, there's so many issues around match fixing and spot fixing in cricket. I can understand why kind of anti-corruption people are taking a look at it. But I think it's kind of great for the sport, right? Because that would have, you know, people would in England at the moment. If you don't know, football is like the biggest sport by miles and miles and miles and miles and miles, right? But yesterday, and was it yesterday or the day before? When they made the comments, and we're on the verge of the Euro starting tonight in Germany. So there's a lot of the back pages are being taken up by football at the moment because the England cricket team isn't doing well anyway. But for kind of a moment, that kind of captured the news cycle over here, and people were talking about it. So, you know, from a marketing perspective, it's great. Rivalry is so important in sport. That's also, you know, to bring it back to from a Sri Lanka perspective, I think that's also why the Bangladesh rivalry is quite important for us, right? Because it gets people outside. We're like the hardcore Sri Lanka fans, right? If Sri Lanka ended up playing you know, against Argentina, we'd be sitting up at 3 o'clock in the morning watching those games and trying to figure out where Argentina have got this left hand seamer from who's cleaning us up in the middle overs, right? But for you know, for a lot of people, for most people, they're not that committed to it. But rivalries are good. That's why, you know, the Nargin's good, and why I welcome Hazelwood's comments. Even though there is a bit of me that does want to see England go through because I live here and it would be easier for me in the long run if they do. Right.
So a little question, I think even Viren might know, Mark. So is it football being the most popular sport? Is it football, cricket, rugby, or football, rugby, cricket? I mean, what's like the second most popular sport in England?
I'd say football, cricket, and then rugby. The gap between football and cricket is huge, right?
Yeah.
To give you like an idea, do you know that I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Tailenders podcast, which was Jimmy Anderson in it.
Yeah.
I went to one of their live shows and Johnny Bairstow was there, and then afterwards, because I know the people who produce it, they were like, "Oh, let's go for a drink." So we went to a pub around the corner. And Jimmy Anderson and Johnny Bairstow were sitting there, and nobody recognised them. And I was literally watching it. I was sitting there thinking, if this was in Colombo, or if this was in Mumbai, or if this was in Lahore, or if this was in Dhaka, there's absolutely no way Jimmy Anderson could just sit in the corner of a pub and nobody would ever recognise who he was, right? Where you couldn't do that with anyone who played who'd played more than about 10 games in the Premier League, right? Wherever they go, there people know who they are. People will come up to them and people will take photos, even if they're very, very far off international football or not playing for like a big side. With rugby players, it's even like their kind of recognition amongst the general public is even lower. So I've literally walked into a McDonald's at 3 o'clock in the morning in Clapham after a night out, and I've seen 4 members of the England team who were playing that day at Twickenham, just sitting there eating chicken nuggets. And it being a very, very busy in the middle of the night and nobody absolutely knowing who they were or bothering them, just thinking they're 4 big guys. And I was like, that's Chris Robshaw and like half the England pack just sitting there. And I was thinking if that was in Colombo, they'd be mobbed, right? I
So
think
that was around 11 p.m.
Pardon?
That was around 11 p.m.
It was after a nightclub. It was next to a nightclub, and it was after the nightclub had finished. I think the boys were in the nightclub as well, and I think that, like, generally speaking, they would have recognised who they were. I personally think rugby's more popular in Sri Lanka than it is in England at the moment. I don't know what you think, Viren, because I know you've lived here as well.
Yeah, so my perfect example was when everyone came up to St Andrews for the Alfred Dunhill Links Championship. There was one group that went out to play. It was Andrew Shevchenko, Mark Boucher, Paul Collingwood. And at the end of the round, I was seated at the jigger inn. The 3 of them walked in. All my friends went to Andrew Shevchenko to get his autograph, get pictures with him. And Mark Boucher and Paul Collingwood were seated having a pint. So I had this perfect opportunity to go and mingle with them for 10, 15 minutes because no one else seemed to know who they were. And Paul Collingwood, I think, was 2 or 3 drinks in and said, I don't think anyone here knows that I'm a T20 World Cup winning captain, which was so bad. Right? And you're talking about a guy who's not just been one of England's best limited overs captain, one of their best fielders, etc. But there were so many other Englishmen around who didn't seem to care about Paul Collingwood and Mark Boucher being there. So every year, whenever these cricketers came up for the Alfred Dunhill, it was prime opportunity for me to actually interact with them because no one else seemed to care at all. So yes, I completely agree. And I think, and I go back to this timing, right, with the Euros and the World Cup. I have a feeling that the hype now around this England-Scotland game bodes well for England in terms of trying to get people to actually stay up to watch a game of cricket as well, because the expectations going into these Euros is insane. I want football to come home this summer, and if Gareth Southgate can't pull this off, I don't think he deserves to be the manager come the next World Cup with the squad that he has with him. So yes, before this goes into a pre-Euro show, because Mark and I will get carried away with talking about football and Jude Bellingham, etc. Yes, I think it's important. It was nice to see, and I think what I'd also like to see going forward is more games like this, more bilateral series between Scotland and England, because there seems to be both teams seem to deliver whenever they face off against each other. I remember watching a game in Scotland when England beat Scotland in a one-off ODI prior to the 2019 World Cup. And that's the first time I saw George Munsey bat live, and I've always loved watching him bat since. I think it's good for the game, good for the rivalry. And yes, teams like Scotland, teams like USA have shown us what they can do during this campaign. They can compete with the very best. And I think this notion of tagging them as associates is A, demeaning, but 2, I think it confounds that gap between the so-called best sides and the associates now. And I say that off the back of Oman's drubbing, but I think with Oman's drubbing yesterday, it was a case of them not being used to facing guys bowling at 145, 150 clicks. Mark Wood, Jofra Archer came out of the syllabus for them in terms of preparation going into the game. So I think we can look at that as a bit of an outlier, but every other team has showcased prowess, even teams like Papua New Guinea in that opening game against West Indies. Mark spoke about moments going your way in T20 cricket. If Papua New Guinea had a couple of overs there at the end where they restricted Andre Russell and Ruston Chase, that first game would have been a banana peel for the hosts.
Yeah, indeed. And we talk about the USA versus India game as well. Those penalty runs that India got, I think that was a huge turning point in my opinion. And I think not so sure even the US keeper knew about that rule properly. when that happened. So yeah, those little things, I mean, play a huge part in T20 cricket. So we talked about West Indies, England. Let's talk a bit about West Afghanistan as well. I mean, how good they have been. I mean, they will definitely give a huge threat to all the other teams to go into the semi-finals, isn't it, Mark?
Yeah, I kind of, I've said this for a little while. I think Afghanistan have a World Cup in them, like a win in them at some point, right? I think there's so many
Like Sri
lessons
Lanka did in
for.
1996, maybe.
Yeah, yeah, it's so similar. It feels similar, doesn't it? Right? It feels like there doesn't feel like there's much kind of depth to Afghan cricket in terms of structure. We know a lot of the boys don't even. I don't think they barely ever get back to Afghanistan, right? People like Rashid Khan. It's. I mean, I think it's obviously Sri Lanka's been through hard times as well, right? So I think we have a bit more kind of empathy for what their situation is. Um, they, that said, I think their situation is also very different to what it's ever been in Sri Lanka, right? Because their politics is very different to what the situation is in Sri Lanka. But they've got that kind of like 96 where Australia and the West Indies wouldn't come to Sri Lanka. These are all stories of legend now in for Sri Lankan cricket fans, right? In a way, it's kind of the whole thing about Australia and England not wanting to play Afghanistan is kind of in a similar vein. I don't want to get into whether or not they should, the an argument of whether they should or shouldn't. But I imagine if if you are part of that setup, you're using that as kind of fuel to get the boys going for it, right? I talked a lot about how disappointing it is how how Hasaranga and a few of the other players were pulled out of the IPL or didn't play the IPL or came home early from it. Afghanistan is a great example of almost all their players, or they've got a fair amount of players who are involved in it, who stayed all the way through the end, or till their team got knocked out. Sorry, the West Indies as well. They've got players who play a lot of franchise cricket, and you're starting to see the fruits of that labour come through. Right, you look at Gurbaz. He ends up playing in the final. Sorry. We'll all remember him from playing in the first. He plays in every LPL. He plays in every franchise tournament he's got. Every single bowler he's going to face, he's seen several times already. His game has developed over the years. You compare him to all the other openers who he played with at the LPL. Only really Patham's the only one who's really kind of gone toe to toe with him and developed like the way he has. There's lots of learnings from Sri Lanka with the way Afghanistan have gone or are going.
So we have a comment from Viren. Afghanistan have the youngest team and still gone from being the dark horse to the leaders of their group. Easily defeating teams like New Zealand. Their batting is no longer their weak link. I mean, that's absolutely correct because most of the time people they tend to talk about the fact that their bowling is so good, but their batting it's not up to the standard. But I think they have changed it around, isn't it, Viren? I mean, Gurbas showing up, and they have someone like Ibrahim Sadran, who's a very good anchor. He can play the whole 20 overs, make a 75, 80 of 60 deliveries, maybe. He has the ability to accelerate as well. So I think they have managed to up their game in the batting unit, and I think that's why they're doing so well, isn't it?
Completely agree, Lakshya. And I think referring back to Junior's question slash comment, I think the one thing about Afghanistan, and I go back to playing a certain brand of cricket, there's absolute role clarity there. You spoke about Ibrahim Zadran being the anchor at the top across formats. I've rated him very, very highly, even prior to the 2023 World Cup in India, where he had a brilliant campaign. He's a top-notch cricketer, and I think he allows players like Gurbaz, like Mohammad Nabi coming in later in Omar Zai, etc., to play their own brand of cricket. When you have players like Ibrahim Zadran, and I think what Jonathan Trott has done brilliantly with the Afghanistan team is bring all these personalities together. The Mohammad Nabis, the Rashid Khans, the Mujibs, the Ramanullah Gurbas. We're talking about T20 franchise cricket stalwarts, as Mark would say. They go around and play in every league around the island. And even their youngsters, players like Noor Ahmed. Noor Ahmed played in the LPL before he even represented the Afghanistan under-19 team. He had the under-19 World Cup with Velalage and co. And that shows you the exposure that's given to these Afghanistani players. And it was only a matter of time before they became real contenders in this particular format. I think this is their strongest format, and followed up by ODI cricket. And if not for Maxwell's heroics at Wankhede, Afghanistan could have gone close to reaching the semi-finals last year. So yes, I think everything is coming together for Afghanistan. I'm going to make a very bold prediction now. They're in the group with Australia, India, and possibly Bangladesh in the Super 8s. Um, I have a feeling they might be able to nick one, either Australia slash India. And if you win 2 games in the Super 8s, you're basically through to the semi-finals. So I see Afghanistan having a long shot here, having a deep run rather, purely because the conditions in West Indies suit them perfectly. We saw that against New Zealand when they came up against Kane Williamson's men. And I want to speak about New Zealand. I feel it's very unfortunate for New Zealand. And Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but I had the notion that this is the end of their golden era, if that makes sense. From 2007 through to this year, they've been absolutely prolific in ICC events. But I feel like they're having a Sri Lanka in 2015 moment where it seems like things are starting to change for them. There's a changing of the guard. Come 2026, the likes of Saudi, Bolt, Williamson, perhaps even players like Daryl Mitchell are reaching the twilight of their careers might kind of have to move aside. And this is where players like Rachin Ravindra, Glenn Phillips have to now take the initiative upon themselves to carry New Zealand forward. Would you agree? Do you think that comparison is fair?
Yeah, I think so. I think cricket's it's unlike other sports. The drop off for players seems to be quite dramatic, right? Once you get over your peak, it falls quite dramatically, and I think it's quite difficult, particularly in T20 cricket, to kind of reinvent yourself. In a way, actually, the one player that kind of keeps constantly kind of reinventing himself and staying relevant is kind of Angelo Matthews, right? You've seen about like 4 different iterations of him through his career, and he's still, he's got his detractors, but he still kind of does things when you need him to. Where other players, I think they kind of struggle with that. And yeah, New Zealand look to me like they've got quite a reasonable core of their team that are probably not going to make it to the next World Cup. So they're going to have to bring in some younger players, and hopefully it goes better for them than it went for Sri Lanka initially when they had to do that.
Another comment from Junior Noor Ahmed played in the LPL, the 100 PSL, and the Big Bash before his T20I debut. So a lot of experience. Another thing, Mark mentioned about the importance of having game time. Look at Mustafizur Rahman. I mean, he came into form in that IPL, and he has converted that into international stage as well. I mean, look how well he bowled in the death yesterday against Netherlands. He bowled like I think, except for that wide in the very first delivery of that over, he took a wicket and then he bowled 5 dot deliveries on the trot. I mean, he was basically unplayable in the last few overs, and I think that really his performance in the IPL, how he came back to form, that's really playing a huge part, isn't it?
Yeah, go back to Noor Ahmed comment as well, right? Because I think it's relevant. How come Noor Ahmed is able to play franchise tournaments before his debut? If that was a Sri Lankan player, like I remember when Patarana and even Teacher were coming through, there was a bit of resistance about the fact that they were going to play in the IPL, right? Why is that happening to players from other countries and not happening to Sri Lankan players? I think across the world, the place it's easiest to find where look at the young talent early is in Sri Lanka, because schools cricket is so developed. And under-19s cricket is so developed across, people are chatting about it across social media. Us three could have a fairly decent shot at 5 or 6 players we think could end up playing for Sri Lanka in a decade's time, right?
Yeah.
Who aren't even 21 yet. So we know that our boys get exposure. Why are we not pushing them to go and play in other tournaments? Maybe we are and they're not getting picked. I don't know. But I think SLC could really be in the front foot on this and could really be trying to place players around the world playing global tournaments and getting that exposure early. If you look at, we look at the Patarana and the Teachner as an example of players who were brought in by CSK as teenagers and have now basically developed into really, really hot property in T20 cricket. That should be the kind of the template for what we want to do with our younger players as they come through. And yeah, I think there's so many learnings from this. We've been through this cycle now, 3-4 times, and I think we are in some ways, in the way we're developing players, we're too stagnant. We're not dynamic enough. We need to look at what other people are doing and try and find best practice. Sorry, I know I keep bringing this point home, but I really feel passionate about it.
So yeah, now if you go back to Afghanistan, this is an interesting stat. They have been every other team in the T20I format since 2018, except for India, Australia, and England. So they'll be meeting two of those teams in the Super 8s, and maybe they can go one up against Australia. Maybe to get that redemption, maybe to redeem themselves for that game in the 50 World Cup from last year. No, Maxwell is not in that good form, but yeah, not sure when he would show up. I mean, he's someone who's so unpredictable, isn't it? He can get back to form anytime. It just takes that one moment, isn't it, Viren?
Completely agree, Laxmi. And I think one thing that I'm looking forward to seeing in this particular group is it's not going to be very straightforward for Australia and India. And I know Sri Lankan fans would hate me for saying this, but Shakib Al Hasan has a point to prove in this World Cup, and he's out there delivering. And this is very unfortunate because last night we saw all the social media discourse linked to Shakib Al Hasan about how he's reinvented himself, how he's still Bangladesh's go-to player in high-pressure situations. And I was trying to make that comparison quite unironically with Angelo Matthews. That's the role we wanted to see him play in this World Cup, to be that player for us who'll step up when the going gets tough. And I know this whole this shouldn't be tagged as an Angelo Matthews versus Shakib Al Hasan kind of section of this chat. But Shakib Al Hasan later on will go down as one of the great all-rounders in international cricket. And it's so unfortunate because a decade ago, that was what we had in store for Angelo Matthews. We always thought Angelo Matthews would go down as unarguably maybe Sri Lanka's greatest ever all-rounder, but an all-rounder that the rest of the world can look at once he calls it a day. But unfortunately, injuries have plagued him. But I also think there's a bit of, as Mark said, there has been external factors at play that hasn't allowed him to thrive throughout. There has been no consistency in terms of selections. He's had phases where he's been completely left out of the side, had to tell people on interviews, etc., that he's still available for limited overs cricket, then brought himself back in. So it's unfortunate. But yeah, I think Afghanistan, Bangladesh will be no walkovers for India and Australia. They'll have to be very careful because Bangladesh, with Mustafizur being in the form of his life, Shakib Al Hasan chipping in, finally them having a leg spinner, I think perhaps the greatest ever leg spinner Bangladesh have ever had in Rishad Hussain, coming in. Things seem to be coming well together for Bangladesh.
And don't forget his batting ability. Can hit the long ball quite easily.
Yeah, and if you have if you have one in the Hasaranga at the other end, I don't think it should be a problem for Rishad. But Bangladesh and Afghanistan will prove to be two difficult opponents for India and Australia. And if any of those two teams take Bangladesh/Afghanistan lightly, they'll regret it big time. And I think let's look at the other group. Provided there are no weather disruptions, I do want England going. I hate saying this as someone who grew up in Scotland / studied in Scotland, but I want to see England going through for the sake of having a semi-competitive second group. With no disrespect to the US or Scotland, you want to see teams like England, Pakistan facing off against each other in the Super 8s. And I think Mark spoke about viewership, branding of this World Cup, etc. And I think you want to see contests like South Africa versus England, West Indies versus England in the Super 8s. But yeah, tonight the weather in Florida isn't looking too good. That might be the end of Pakistan's campaign. And kudos to the US. I think no one gave them a chance. I think everyone looked at Scotland as potential as a potentially good side to compete against England, Australia. But I have to put my head out there and say I never thought USA stood a chance of progressing from this group. and the fact that they did should also be a wake-up call to the ICC and also the Asian Cricket Council to not always pair India and Pakistan together in the same group. Because if one other team comes up with an upset in that group, it makes it very difficult for the other team to go through. We saw that happening. We nearly saw that happening in the Asia Cup on a couple of instances. So it's important that, yes, as much as we glorify this India-Pakistan rivalry, that we allow it to happen organically, like we do with other rivalries, like the Australia-England rivalry that Mark was speaking about earlier.
Exactly, and also I think maybe they should stop predetermining the spots in the Super 8, isn't it? Because I mean, if we technically look at the current points table, we're in, things would have been a lot more different. Because Australia now they might win their group, but they will still go in as the second place team of the group. So I mean, the pairings would have been a lot different if that was not the case. But yeah, anyway. So anything to add from the both of you before we finish the show?
Yeah.
Mark, yeah, really?
Sorry, I'll let you finish off with Mark, but there's a comparison I want to make with what you just said. And I think the perfect example is the Euros or even the FIFA World Cup, right? You have your top two teams going through in no particular predetermined order. But in the Euros, you also have your best four third place teams going through. So if the ICC is speaking about scheduling, ticket, like uncertainties linked to ticket sales, etc., take a leaf out of football because that's how a World Cup slash tournament is properly run, right? And you let the tournament run organically. All these groups in the Euros have some mouth-watering encounters, but none of those were predetermined, none of those were pre-allocated. You just let the tournament flow. And I want to make a point that Haritha said on our show yesterday. If you want to, we've seen the beauty of this 20-team World Cup. And in an ideal setting, if the sport continues to expand, I think a 32 World Cup is the dream in this particular format, right? A 32-team World Cup. That's the template in football. Yes, football and cricket are on two different levels altogether. But if cricket can reach that stage where you have at least 28 to 32 teams competing, that'd be brilliant. I'm for this expansion, especially in this format. We've seen all the associates step up. We've seen USA, we've seen Scotland, we've seen the likes of Uganda having a platform to shine, and that's exactly what we need going forward.
I think the future of the way this format works is really interesting, right? Because I think there's a lot of lessons we've learned from this tournament. I think that's, the associate teams are that the gap's not that big, but also I think the lesson from that is that teams like Sri Lanka should be looking to play more associate sides, even if that means sending out kind of almost 18, not necessarily our first string teams to go out. What's wrong with sending a kind of one and a half, our first stroke seconds out to go, a kind of development side to go to tour the US or tour Canada or play Oman more frequently than they currently are. But I do think that if you had 32 sides, I think that would be too much. 12, is there 12 more good enough teams to really make a kind of impact? I mean, obviously, the team that I feels missing is definitely Zimbabwe, and I do think that there's probably more sides in Africa who, given a bit of space to develop their game and knowing that there's more chance of getting into the World Cup, could put something on. You look at teams like Malaysia, I think, like who can UAE, Malaysia. So you're like, I mean, I can think of there's maybe, and I don't know, maybe someone like Fiji might be able to put a decent side together. I don't know how to develop cricketers in Fiji. I'm just kind of spitballing here now.
I think Italy and Spain, they have some good sides. There's Qatar from Asia, Bahrain, Bermuda. I think those sides, I mean, they have some good T20 sides. Not sure whether they'll be able to compete at the world stage, but I mean, from what Viren mentioned, the 32-team World Cup will give them the opportunity to at least showcase their talents. And I mean, until they actually meet better opponents, we'll never know what might happen. Because if we take this tournament as an example, USA performing really well against the top nations.
I do think it's a bit chicken and egg, but I think you need to go and look at like how developed cricket is in each of these places, right? Like where are these players coming from, what kind of level are they playing at? Because I think there is an element of if you go put the France team in there, for example, and they end up having a number 11 facing off against Paterano, who's driving that ball into the deck at 140 clicks, and you're like, oh boy, that's not a good situation for anyone involved in that, right? If that guy isn't ready or prepared for that moment, then who knows what could happen, right? So I think I'm very up for cricket expanding, but I think it needs to be done in a maybe kind of there needs a little bit more thought to it, basically, because there has been a few games which I've been like, this is not nowhere near the level of what some of the other games are in this tournament. I think the pitches have been a bit of a great leveler. That USA India was an absolutely fantastic game, but I don't think the USA get anywhere near as close if it's not played in New York, right? If that's played in the Caribbean and they're look a lot further away. I don't want to down talk the associates because the history of Sri Lankan cricket is a history of trying to get people to play cricket against us, right? And us fighting for our little piece of the pie. And I don't want to deny anyone else a piece of the pie, but I think it needs to be done in a slightly more constructive, in a slightly more constructive way, right? Also, I think it's probably worth, when you go through these sides, looking at where these players are coming from. I'm not begrudging anyone an international career, but in terms of how developed is that nation as a cricket nation, if it's basically made up of expats who somehow ended up playing, if they've moved over to work for Oracle and ended up playing for them, that is a fantastic story. But it also is a reflect. If your squad is 12 foreign, what are effectively foreign ball players who've learned cricket in a different place, and 3 local stars, then it's maybe not quite as developed as you think it is. I think you look at Ireland as an example. We were given kind of full test status, and I'm not really sure what Test cricket has brought to Irish cricket beyond a kind of vote at the top table. But everything else around it seems to be quite a bit of a struggle. Getting full status, getting regular access to good fixtures will not fix a cricket, the problems that your cricket association has. It might make it easier to fix them. I still think it's all about the work that you're doing at the grassroots to spread the game and get kids playing it. And that's hopefully what should have happened in America. Should have inspired loads more American kids to take up the game and get involved. I don't know if it's done that. And we won't know if it's done that for another 10 years, right?
Exactly. So, we don't anything to add just before we end the show? Anything more?
No, just like Mark. Thank you once again for joining us.
Thanks for having me, guys. I love coming on anytime.
And looking forward to having you
pleasure.
on at the end of the World Cup as well. And I want to get your take. What's your one bold prediction you make for the second half of this World Cup? Is there something that you think will happen that might be quite unpopular amongst the fans?
Oh, look, I'd love to see, but like the 2 teams I'd love to see win it would be the West Indies. I think Sri Lankans have a natural affinity to the way they play cricket and to the West Indies. I think we see a lot of ourselves in being an island nation, and the way we aspire to play cricket as well. And the other side that I'd love to see do really well would be Afghanistan. I'm not sure of the draw, if it's even possible for them to play each other in the final, but can you imagine what it would be like if they both got to the final, kind of one in the eye for the big 3, right? Yeah, it'd be great if that happened. And I don't know. There's something about this format and the pace of it that makes me feel like it's kind of quite slow. Maybe I'm a bit bruised because we're Sri Lanka fans, right? But I kind of feel it's not to the Super 8 that it gets going. So let's see how it develops in the next few weeks.
And thanks again. Thank you very, very much. It means a lot to us to have had you on for this show.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks for having
Thank
me,
you.
guys.
Thank
I
you very
love
much,
coming
Mark.
on.
Thank you so
No,
much. Pleasure to have you. And yeah, hopefully we'll meet once again, maybe just before the end of the World Cup. And yeah, I mean, I really want to see that happening. Afghanistan versus West Indies final. I mean, how cool it would be to see such a final. So thank you very much, Mark. As always, it's a great pleasure to have you with us. Ren, thank you to you as well. So hopefully we'll meet in the evening. So yeah, so thank you very much, everyone, for joining with us on Ion Cricket. We are expecting to bring you lots and lots of content in the upcoming 2 weeks surrounding the T20 World Cup. So make sure to subscribe to Ion Cricket, hit the bell icon as well, and also to share the channel with your cricket, with your friends who are big cricket fans. So thank you very much once again. Thank you to Viren and Mark as well. We'll meet all of you once again with another show very soon. Stay tuned to Ion Cricket.